Let me introduce myself. My name is Shachar Pinsker, and I'm a professor of Judaic Studies and Middle East Studies, and the Associate Director of the Frankel Center at the University of Michigan. And on behalf of the co-directors, Naomi Brenner from the Ohio State University and Matt Handelman from Michigan State University, I want to welcome everybody who came to join us remotely, really from all over the world. And whether you are a long-time participant in the project, a recent collaborator, or interested in the topics and the materials, and are just joining us for the first time, welcome to everybody. As you know, we are here to mark and celebrate the publication of the website of the project, the Feuilleton and Modern Jewish Cultures. You have the URL, the feuilletonproject.org in the chat, and hopefully you can open it. And we will have a chance not just to celebrate, but also a little bit to discuss the website and the project and the materials that we gather together. But before we do that and turn into the program, I want to, there's lots of people I need to thank. I will thank some of them later on, but I want to start by thanking people at the Frankel Center who helped to make this event available and actually supported the project from its very beginning. So thank you very much to Julian for all the technical help and putting this together and communicating with everybody and making everything here possible and smooth. And I want to thank Scott Spector, the director of the Frankel Center, for his support in the project, and some participated in the project. And I want to invite him just to say a few words on behalf of the Frankel Center.
Thank you. It's nice to be here and welcome everyone to the virtual space of this webinar, which, you know, on the one hand, I wish that we would be meeting in person. Today at the Frankel Center, we would have been happy to host, and yet in another way, this virtual space is emblematic of the space of the Feuilleton itself. That is to say, this kind of virtuality encapsulates, you know, the ways in which the Feuilleton form, you know, kind of embodies the shifting dynamics of time and space in modern media. And you know, that the Feuilleton is not simply a novel form of urban literature, but as I think this website and this whole project really amply demonstrates, occupies a space of modernity that connects to other spaces and that shakes up temporality in certain ways, even as it produced a kind of simultaneity for people reading the Feuilleton in their different spaces. If you click through the website, as I hope you will, if you haven't already, I think it will become clear how the very form of the project helps shed light on these dynamics of the Feuilleton in ways that I have found really exciting. And that we've also outlined in, if I can give a little plug of our winter issue of Frankly Speaking, our newsletter has a whole spread on this project with an interview of our own Shachar Pinsker that I recommend to you, and you can find it on our website. I'll put a little cue in the chat now that I think of it, so that people, you know, can get to that newsletter. I didn't want to take any more time today, but just to say how happy I am to be contributing to this institutionally. I have a personal interest in Feuilleton. I've written on it somewhat myself in the context of turn of the century Prague. Naomi Brenner was an undergraduate student of mine, wrote an honors thesis here. Shachar, of course, is my colleague. Matt is my long-term colleague and neighbor. And, the networks connecting us all can remind me of that network quality of the Feuilleton itself. And I did also want to point out how I think the current project really brings us out of what we knew about the Feuilleton before in earlier projects that I have contributed in part of volumes and so forth, in that it shows the global dimensions of the Feuilleton and how these connect to Jewishness and Judaism, something I'd like to hear more about today. And with that, I'll just pass it on to who's ever next. I don't know if it's Naomi or if it's Matt, but could you let us know something about the rules of the game today, how you want us to use the chat, how we should raise our hands for discussion, that sort of thing. But I did just want to put my plug in to welcome you to the virtual space.
Right. Thank you. Thank you so much, Scott. And yes, I will say just a few words here about the plan for today. And Naomi, feel free if you want to add. So I will give a very brief intro to the project right now, and then we will move right away into a round table where we're going to have 6 speakers who are going to speak for about 5 minutes about a specific text that is featured in the digital collection, and that is actually a text that they did not contribute and wrote about, but another text, another Feuilleton text that they read and found really interesting. So we are looking forward to that. And after that, which should take about 30 minutes, about half an hour, we're going to have a conversation and Q&A. And we'll talk a little bit about where the project is right now, and also the future of the project. We'll talk a little bit about the website itself and how it was created. So that's more or less our program for today. And I hope it will be interesting and generative for everybody. Naomi, do you want to add anything?
I think that sounds great. I'm looking forward to continuing on through our program.
Okay, great. Yeah, and you can use the chat, along the way. This is not really structured as a webinar, but as a Zoom meeting. So we have a few people that we asked before and agreed to speak. But anyone who has any question or any comment, you can use the chat. And of course, later on, when we have the Q&A and the discussion, people are also going to be able to unmute themselves and ask questions. So we hope to hear from as many of you as possible. Again, whether you are a long-term contributor to the project, or just recently found out about it and interested to learn more. So I'm going to go ahead and just give a very brief introduction to the project and to the topic and to the website, and then we'll go into the round table. So as many of you know, the project has been going since 1917. This is when we started the project. It was a collaboration started as a collaboration between Naomi Brenner and myself, each one of us. 2017, it's a long time ago, hard to believe, when each one of us from our own research became curious about the topic of the Feuilleton. And as Scott said, each one of us with our own work encountered some texts that are designated as Feuilleton, maybe knew something about it, maybe knew a lot about it, but all of us felt that something was missing. And this something that was missing was really the global multilingual element of the Feuilleton. We all know or most of us know, hopefully, about where the Feuilleton actually began in Paris around 1800, but then how did it actually move so quickly to so many places? What exactly is it? Is it a genre? Is it a form? We know it's all connected to the newspaper. And those of us who are working in Jewish and non-Jewish languages started to think about this peculiar and interesting and generative connection between the Feuilleton and Jews, both in what is known as the Jewish press and in general in the press and in the media of modernity, of the 19th, the 20th century and beyond. So the project really started with in 2017, and then later on continued with some help and support, financial support from the American Academy of Jewish Research, from the Frankel Center, and from our own institutions. We did a number of symposia and conferences at the University of Michigan, in Ohio State University, and then we received support from the National Endowment for Humanities in 2019, which enabled us to bring it really into the global sphere. We did a wonderful conference at the Hebrew University and the National Library in Israel in 2019, and we continued to do some workshops and symposia where we started to bring people to discuss specific text and to think about them in the context of the Feuilleton. Yeah, and you can find previous events of everything that we did from 2017 until recently in the website. At some point, of course, COVID hit us, and we planned a big conference at the University of Michigan in 2020, but of course, this was not possible. We very quickly pivoted to move online to Zoom, and I'm thinking about what Scott said, that maybe joining remotely with people from all over the world is very appropriate for the genre and for the form. In some way it is. In some ways, there was something about the meetings that was very important for us, but we continued with a number of online workshops with expanding and thinking about different languages, about Ladino, about Judeo-Arabic, about Dutch, about texts from many different places that, as Scott mentioned before, and as many of us who thought about the Feuilleton really in the context of German, French, Russian, Hebrew, and Yiddish, started to really expand it. And we knew from the very beginning, well, at some point from the very beginning, that we want to put not a comprehensive somehow collection of Feuilletons, because that's really impossible. We don't even know how many of them there are in all the different languages. But we knew that we wanted to create a beautiful website with a collection of texts that, again, is not going to be comprehensive. Also, maybe is not going to be representative in any way, because how can you represent something that is so vast, and also something that the borders are not really clear, you know? Feuilletons still exist. Maybe later on we'll talk about it. Feuilletons in the 21st century and in so many different newspapers, periodicals, other forms of media, and so many different languages. But we wanted everybody to have at least some taste of the richness of the material, and to raise awareness to the importance of the Feuilleton as a historical form of media with contemporary implications. So if you look at the collection, and I hope all of you did already or will continue to do, something that is very clear is the Feuilleton transcends regional, national, religious, and linguistic borders. We brought together scholars from different disciplines, languages, and cultures to work together and to explore the breadth and the depth of the Feuilletons. And right now we have a modest but quite significant, and I think it's already in the chat, but it doesn't hurt maybe to put it again, the collection, which I think is really the heart of the project. Right now, if I'm not mistaken, because it's been built and we continue to collect materials all the time, but I think right now we have 26 text, which of course is not a lot in the grand scheme of all the Feuilletons, but we're very proud of this collection with text in English, in French, in German, in Hebrew, in Dutch, in Judeo-Arabic, in Ladino, in Russian, in Spanish, in Saran Tongo, and of course in Yiddish. I just want to mention that we plan to include very soon text in Polish. We know there are a number of texts in Polish that we are working on to translate and to explicate, and to other languages. Of course, we also notice here the timeline, and you see when you explore the text that you can see not just the text themselves in the original publication in the newspaper or the periodicals or other forms, and it's very important to have, for us to have the original publication side by side with English translation and commentary that was created by our contributors, who are really expert to help to contextualize those texts, whether from historical point of view, literary point of view, and otherwise. I'm sure you all noticed the timeline. And again, we did not want to pose any rigid definition of what the Feuilleton is beyond the kind of general understanding of what it is as a form in the media, its appearance often, but not always below the line. But yeah, we really didn't want to pose very rigid definitions, and we also didn't want to pose any timeline. So the timeline, which is now with these 26 Feuilletons, the early one is from 1846, and the latest one is from 1956. That's a Hebrew Feuilletons in Ma'ariv, and I know that one of the questions that people already asked me when they looked at it is, why stopping in 1956? And the answer is, there's no reason to stop at 1956. It's only that these are the texts that so far we collected. But yeah, that's maybe something that we can continue to explore and to think about. Does the Feuilleton still exist today? And if it is, where and why, and in what forms? And of course, we know that there are Feuilletons, relevant Feuilletons, important texts before the mid 19th century, from the early 19th century, with the first Feuilleton that appeared in Paris. Very quickly, we see them appearing in French and German and other languages, Russian as well, with Jews participating in it, and also a lot of this discussion about Jews, Jewishness, Judaism in the context of modernity. So we are looking forward to expand that as well. I want to mention, before we go into the roundtable, to thank all the people, of course, all of you, many of you are here, who contributed to the project so far and to the website, whether by suggesting and recommending a text to include, whether you helped us, and we needed all the help in the world to locate the original text. Some of them came from the historical Jewish Press Project at the National Library, and from the compact memory that collects the German Jewish media, but many of them are coming from different archives. Many of them have not been digitized, so we thank you for doing the work of digitizing it and bringing it. We are thanking all the people who worked very hard on translation of these texts from many different languages into English. So we'll have English as a shared language. And also, of course, for all the people who wrote really illuminating commentaries on the text. And I want to thank also the people who are experts in digital humanities and worked very hard on this. First and foremost, I don't know if she's still around here. I know she's going in and out. Julia Falkovich-Hein, who is really an expert on creating a beautiful website, and we'll talk later on. I know Julia is not going to be able to present, but Matt will represent her and other people who help. We received a lot of help from many technical people in other archives and libraries, in the National Library in Israel, in libraries and archives all over the world, and also here at the University of Michigan with LSNA technology. So I want to thank all these people. So I hope that gave you a little bit of an overview of the project and the website and where we are. Of course, this is not the end of anything. We are just marking this very happy occasion of the launching of the website. But as we speak, I think this morning, actually, Matt Handelman, who is one of the co-editors, added a text that was missing. So this is growing all the time and will continue to grow. So we are really just marking this moment as an important and very happy moment of launching the website, but of course it will continue to grow and develop. And part of what we hope today to do today towards the end of the meeting is to talk about that, exactly about where we're hoping to move from here, and we want to hear from all of you. So I'm going to turn to the co-director, Naomi Brenner, to facilitate the next segment of the program.
Thank you, Shachar. So I am, well, it's a lot of fun to be sharing the site with you today. And when we were talking among the three of us about how we wanted to do this, given the well, constraints of the time, but also the opportunities of the time, which is to say Zoom events, you know, it really became obvious that for a collaborative project like this one, we wanted to see if we could spotlight different participants in the project that really speaks to how this entire work has come together. So I'll really briefly take the opportunity to thank my co-directors. I've been working with Shachar and with Matt for several years now in different phases of this project, whether it's been the grant applications or the conferences and the workshops, and most recently the website with the texts and the translations and the commentaries. And it has been such a wonderful experience to be part of a collaborative project. And that extends well beyond us as co-directors as well, as I think you're probably picking up on. We have many different people who have participated in so many different stages of our project, whether it is in some of the early conferences. I see people logged on right now who are part of the very first conference at the University of Michigan back in 2017, throughout conferences, workshops, at the AJS, now through the website. So many different people have been involved. So there's no better way to do that than to turn the spotlight over to some of the people who have contributed to the project in many different ways. So I'm going to ask a series of people to speak briefly about one of the texts on the site. Now, I'm going to ask each person to actually introduce themselves very briefly so that I don't take up too much time talking now. But each person has contributed to the project in some way, but they're actually going to be speaking not about their own contributions to the project, but rather to one of the texts that they have found that has sort of piqued their interest, connected with their work, or resonated with their teaching, that is now published on the website. So we're going to go first to Carrie Wallach, who's going to start off with one of our earlier texts on the website. Carrie, go ahead.
Thanks so much, Naomi. I'm really happy to be here and to talk about something other than what I contributed. But I'm in the German Studies department at Gettysburg College. I'm associated with the Jewish Studies program there as well. And I think I first came to work on the Feuilleton in my dissertation over 10 years ago when I was working on women in the Weimar Jewish press. And at that time, I was really interested in the rich newspaper and magazine source base. I looked at about 20 German and 5 Yiddish papers from Weimar, Germany. And that led me to think about the Feuilleton as a place for both fiction and cultural criticism coming from the German perspective. And for me, one of the things that I kind of put together as an argument was that if we were thinking about a genre of a Jewish Feuilleton, if there was such a thing, at least in the German context, we might, at least what I was looking at, it seemed to sort of lack some of the satirical wit or irony that mainstream Feuilleton had, and it focused instead on prominent Jewish figures and advocating for Jews politically, and had sort of a special interest in answering the question of like, is this good for the Jews? And many of the women's contributions that I was particularly interested in by female journalists, including Doris Wittner and Berta Bad-Strauss, and Doris Wittner is the one that I contributed to this project. Many of those feuilletons also looked specifically at Jewish women's contributions. And I just wanted to say one other thing that I'm still dealing with in terms of feuilleton in my own work. I'm currently writing a biography of artist Rachel Shalit Marcos, and I presented on that last year at a workshop for this project. But because Shalit was active in both Germany and in France, that led me to look at some French Jewish newspapers as well, to think about some of these transnational connections between Germany and France. And again, this sort of global and transcending boundaries, borders dimension of culture and art and cultural criticism. That made me a little bit familiar with the newspaper that I looked at and that I want to talk about today, which is L'Univers Israélite, a French Jewish newspaper. And today I wanted to talk about the contribution, which I guess is one of the earliest ones in this project from 1855. It's Letters of a Parisian Woman by Julian Bloch. My French is not so good, so please forgive me. But it was provided for this website by Yahel Matalon, who did the translation and commentary. And this is a really interesting feuilleton for me, coming from this German perspective as opposed to a French one, because it was easy to see that there were some parallels, but also some differences. According to the commentary provided on this website by Matalon, Julian Bloch was a journalist who was providing this sort of lively, engaging, and even caustic commentary on current events in France and on French Jewish life. So to hear that she was engaging with that sort of caustic, satirical perspective already in the mid-19th century was really exciting to hear. And another parallel that I noticed, and I know it's sort of a taboo in thinking about a feminist perspective to think about women with respect to their male relatives or counterparts, but I found it really interesting that Julian Bloch's entry into journalism seems to have been through her father, Simon Bloch, who was the editor and founder of L'Univers Israélite. So she came to journalism perhaps due to her familial connections, or had this opportunity to contribute so much because of those, not unlike Doris Wittner in the German Jewish context. But in the feuilleton, Letters of a Parisian Woman, this is like a series of feuilletons that Julian Bloch wrote. She comments on the festivities celebrating a visit by Queen Victoria to France. And she's just generally excited on behalf of women in general, that any woman is being celebrated this much. And it seems to her to be a kind of revenge for dishonored women who were not celebrated. And she uses as an example the biblical Queen Vashti to bring us to Purim, which is coming tomorrow. So it seemed really fascinating to me to think about how a historical figure like Queen Victoria somehow for this journalist provided an antidote to a biblical story about women being dishonored. And she sort of continues and extends the metaphor in ways that do and don't make sense. Thinking about what would it mean if Queen Victoria were open-minded enough to take a Jewish husband, and she says a nephew of some Mordechai or other from our city, just like Ahasuerus took Queen Esther. But I think one of the things she's not really thinking about is the fact that Esther didn't disclose her Jewishness prior to being chosen. And so thinking about the way that Jewish identity was presented and concealed in the 19th century is something interesting. But Bloch's also further connecting to other historical events, contemporary events in her time period. She's interested in the fact that Baron de Rothschild in England was still being denied a place in the House of Commons. He didn't get sworn in until a few years after she published this Feuilleton. So she's connecting as much as she can to what's going on around her and to Jewish culture, what's going on around her. And she also talks about the achievements of French Jewish students and female students. And it's clear that she's addressing other Jewish journalists and Jewish readers. She uses all kinds of nice phrases like, I wish Jewish journalists a pen that is a torch lit from the sacred fire of faith. Somehow faith and religion can drive cultural production. So for me, this Feuilleton by Julian Bloch offers insights into the ways that women were able to become successful Jewish feuilletonists in the 19th century, not a given, and also helps us remember that some of these Jewish women journalists were invested in writing on behalf of women and sometimes specifically Jewish women, and they didn't hesitate to draw on well-known Jewish female role models, in this case, biblical ones, even while commenting on current events. That's sort of still their reference point that they assumed everyone had, the biblical role models. And they mobilized some of these figures to measure the progress that was being made in contemporary times on behalf of both Jews and women. So that's all I'd like to say. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Carrie. Really wonderful way to start off. Now we're going to go to Michal from Cohen. Michal, I'll have you start by introducing yourself. And in the meantime, we'll see if we can make it possible for you to share a document. I'll work on that while you start off. Oh, you need to unmute.
Oh, okay. My name is Dr. Michal from Cohen. I'm affiliated with the Open University of Israel. I wrote my dissertation on the 19th century writer Sarah Fage Foner, and a book adaptation of my dissertation was just published in Israel by Wrestling. Feuilletons were a common form of writing in the 19th century Hebrew press, and I encountered many of them in the course of my research. Sarah Foner did not publish feuilletons, but another woman, Miriam Markel Moseson, published several feuilletons in the Hebrew press at that time. My contribution to the Feuilleton project was my presentation at the conference in Jerusalem in 2019 on the Feuilleton Hebrew Woman and Jewess by Elchanan Leib Levinsky, which appeared in Hatzfira in 1892. So I'm overall interested in women writer and the way women are presented and treated or were treated in the 19th century by the male Hebrew writers. While writing my dissertation, I encountered several Hebrew translations of Grace Aguilar's novel, The Veil of Cedars, and I gave a talk on the ideological differences between these translations at an academic conference last year. Two of these translations appeared as feuilletons in Hebrew newspapers, and one of them, which appeared in Halevanon under the title The War of Faith and Love, is posted on the Feuilleton Project website. The contributor is Professor Lita Levi from Princeton University, who unfortunately is not here today. And I will begin my presentation with the other translation since it appeared first. Can I share the document? Oh, let's see. Oh, good. Okay. So in 1872, the renowned Hebrew poet Yehuda Leib Gordon started to publish his translation of The Veil of Cedars in Hamelitz. Gordon was so well known that his last name was sufficient on the newspaper's title page. And we can see here Gordon, simply, of course, in a Yiddish transliteration still. And Gordon Okay, the title of Gordon's translation was The Crater's Dwellers, Yoshvei HaMachtesh, which is an odd alteration since the Hebrew word for a vale or valley, emek, was available to him. In fact, the translation of Avraham Shalom Friedberg, which was published only in book form in 1874, is titled Emek HaArazim, the Vale of Cedars. Okay. Gordon indicated that his translation was from German, which means from the German translation of the English original. He did not indicate, however, who the author was, which is also odd, because he was a champion of women's writing. He encouraged Sarah Fege-Foner, Miriam Merkel-Moseson, and other women to write and publish in Hebrew. In fact, he had a long correspondence with Miriam Merkel-Moseson, which was published in Israel under the title Yedidato Shel HaMeshorer, the poet's friend. So, okay, Gordon specified that his translation was Bli Metzarim, which means without limits, but in fact the translation followed the English original almost word per word, and I tried to show it, the first paragraph of the original and the translation. Gordon did not complete his translation. The same year, 1872, he moved to St. Petersburg, where he was appointed secretary of the Jewish community and the Society for the Spread of Enlightenment among the Jews of Russia. The last installment of his translation appeared in December 1872. It indicated, like the other installments, to be continued, but there were no further installments. 2 years later, in 1874, another Hebrew translation began to appear in Halevanon under the title The War of Faith and Love. The title page of Halevanon referred to it as a story, sipur, not a translation, without an author's name. Okay, the translator was Yeshayahu Gelbhaus, and he is mentioned here in the actual translation. And he was not well known, he was only in his 20s, and perhaps this is why his name didn't appear on the title page. Okay, the alteration of the title from the Vale of Cedars to the War of Faith and Love was appropriate for Halevanon, an Orthodox newspaper directed at an Orthodox readership. This in contrast with Hamelitz, which was a mouthpiece of the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment. Gelbhaus completed his translation in less than a year, and the editor of Halevanon, Yechiel Bril, was so pleased with it that he published it as a book. Gelbhaus added an introduction to the book where he acknowledged Grace Aguilar as the original author and praised her passionately. Thus, ironically, it was Halevanon, an Orthodox venue, rather than Hamelitz, an Enlightenment venue, where Grace Aguilar was recognized for her literary achievement. And I would add that there is a reference to Gordon's translation in Ha'olam, another Enlightenment newspaper, which was published in Odessa in 1913. And again, it did not mention Grace Aguilar, only the Crater's Dwellers by Gordon, which was not completed. So thank you very much. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Michal, very much. Let's move on now to Ofer Dines.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ofer, and I'm an assistant professor in Slavic Studies at Columbia University, and I'm a scholar of Eastern European Jewish history and literature. Today, I'm going to talk about a feuilleton in Ladino, authored by an Ottoman Jewish intellectual. The question I will ask is though central to my own scholarship. What is the relationship between Jewish languages and Jewish politics? My analysis builds on the beautiful translation, commentary, and scholarship of my friend and colleague, Tamir Carcassonne. So this is an untitled feuilleton authored by Baruch Mitrani in 1890, published in his journal Karmi Sheli, My Orchard. Mitrani was a rabbi, educator, writer, and Hebrew reformer, active during the second half of the 19th century in Edirne, Istanbul, Jerusalem, Sofia, and Vienna. In his sermon, Mitterrand unpacks what came to be known as the dialectic of enlightenment. The enlightenment, according to Mitrani, is a fine garden which bears the roses of liberty, equality, and fraternity. It is also, however, the progenitor of nationalism and political anti-Semitism, a new form of the centuries-old prejudice against Jews. So what makes this Feuilleton really interesting is how the medium, a Feuilleton in Ladino, a Jewish language, shapes and informs the message. What I ask is the nexus of Jewish languages and political thought. And how does writing about politics shapes one's linguistic ideology? Mitterrand's Feuilleton is a masterful example of the potentiality of thinking about politics within and without the limits of the traditional Jewish vocabulary. What I'm going to do right now is I'm going to share the text, and you're going to have a better sense of what I'm talking about. I think it doesn't work, so I'm just going to carry through. So the first paragraph draws on the programmatic feature of all Jewish languages, the idea of fusion. A fusion of the Hebrew component and the foreign component. Mitterrand fuses a list of enemies of Israel with the ending ismor, or ism, to highlight what he perceives as the immutability of anti-Judaism. And he lists a name of ideologies he calls Kainism or Kainism, Nimrodism, Savism, Levinism, Forism, Nebuchadnezzarism, Hamanism, and so on and so forth, all the way to Inquisitionism. The fusion is the productive element in Jewish languages. This is what makes these languages Jewish. Mitterrand uses fusion to broaden the political vocabulary of Ladino, coining new neologisms, new political concepts. At the same time, the use of the Hebrew component is meant to highlight a sense of atemporality. Strikingly, Mitterrand's subversive use of the linguistic fusion reimagines the traumatic encounter with the other, not as a concept which is foreign to Jewish culture, but rather as its most traditional inherent element. He cuts the tension inherent to Jewish languages as if it was fundamental to Jewish history as a whole. These enemies of God, Mitterrand continues, alluding to the anti-Semites, wish to hamper the enormous steps that are being taken by modern civilization. The terms I've just mentioned, word and civilizations, in Ladino are borrowed from French, which confers a higher status and a flair of modernity. The Hebrew component is relegated in Mitterrand's Ladino to the parenthesis, serving as a scaffolding towards the creation of a modern Ladino political language, which is free from fusion. In Mitterrand's political linguistic ideology, Ladino inhabits a world which is free from the Hebrew element and is also free from anti-Semitism. Thanks.
Thank you, Ofer. Okay, moving on. We're continue to jump, even though with many of these, I would love to hear more. We're going to go now to Ayelet Brin.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ayelet Brin, and I'm currently a scholar in residence at the Hadassah Brandeis Institute. I'm an American Jewish historian, and my work focuses on questions of gender, popular culture, and the history of the American Yiddish press. So feuilletons and other newspaper features are crucial to helping me think about how the American Yiddish press functioned and how newspapers mediated between a variety of American, European, and transnational Jewish influences for themselves and for their readers. And for the website, I contributed a pair of texts by Abraham Kahan that first appeared in English and in Yiddish and show how Kahan straddled the English and Yiddish language American press and tried to translate between them in a variety of ways. But the text that I'll be speaking about today is a Yiddish language feuilleton by Yankiv Azrael Davidson that ran in 1911 in the South African publication Der Afrikaner from a series called A Peckel Tchinas, or A Bundle of Tchinas. It was submitted to the website by Eli Rosenblatt and translated by Veronica Belling. It's a parody of a traditional form of Yiddish vernacular prayer called tchinas that were in the Eastern European context usually associated with women and were a way for these women to personally connect with God. So in this series, Davidson adapted this traditional prayer to be the mouthpiece for various common figures in the South African Jewish landscape. And in the example featured on the Feuilleton website, it's a tchina for an English rov, a rabbi who has absorbed British Jewish intellectual positions and in the process lost touch with his congregants, with Jewish tradition, and with the racial and cultural landscape of colonial South Africa writ large. So Davidson uses this feuilleton to mock this character's false piety, his lack of religious knowledge, and his contempt for newer immigrants' rituals and practices. And altogether, as Rosenblatt argues in his commentary, this tchina serves as a critique of both internal hierarchies being created at this time within South African Jewish culture, and a critique of the racism of the colonial system in place in South Africa more broadly at this time. So I was so taken by this text because of what it can tell us about the dialectic between tradition and adaptation in the global Yiddish press, a dynamic I was much more familiar with in the North American context than other contexts before engaging with the feuilleton's more international array of sources. So in evoking tchinas, Davidson was drawing on traditional genres in Jewish culture, ones that were often denigrated as feminine or mass religious culture in the Eastern European context, but he imbued them with new meaning by showing how they speak to the racial and intercommunal tensions specific to his context of early 20th century South Africa. So for me, it evoked similar experiments within the early American Yiddish press, like the Sidra, a series where Abraham Kahan explains socialist theories to a tradition-oriented audience of new immigrants by taking on the form of Dvar Torahs, commentaries on the Torah portion of the week, or the Bintel Brief, a bundle of letters, Kahan's famous advice column, or early women's columns in the American Yiddish press, where prominent editors took on female personas like the Orthodox Lithuanian wise woman or the radical Sophia housewife to infuse the genre of women's columns with their newspaper's particular worldview. So for my research, this sort of source provides a useful case study to think through the connections between the Yiddish press in various areas of the world, literal connections like people or content moving back and forth, but also more abstract connections like shared desires to mediate between tradition and change and to infuse older Yiddish cultural forms with new meaning, but also how important it is to place Yiddish culture in very local context, in this case, South Africa, in order to fully understand its resonance. And for my teaching, I'd be really excited to put this piece into conversation with some of my sources about gender and the American Yiddish press because of the traditionally gendered feminine connotations of tchina as a genre, or with some of the great scholarship that's being done at the moment about Yiddish language responses to American racism and racial violence, which has explored how poets and prose writers were also often using sources drawn from Jewish history or Jewish liturgy to express support or empathy or criticism relating to what was going on in America. So I'm glad that I had a chance to dig into this source for this presentation, and I'm excited to continue to explore the other sources now available on the website. Thanks.
Thank you, Ayelet. We have two more presenters, two more speakers, and we'll go now to Eli Rosenblatt.
Hello, thank you very much to everyone for being here, and to Naomi, Matt, and Shachar for shepherding this project to its at least first signpost of completion. So I teach in the Religious Studies Department at Northwestern University. And I guess my connection to the Feuilleton is that it comes up because a lot of what I work on, that is sort of a Yiddish culture, Yiddish literature, Ashkenazic Jewish culture in contexts outside of Europe, is that the archive, the historical archives are comparatively small. So they don't have the vastness that the Eastern European Yiddish archive possesses, obviously. And so I had to turn to literary sources And so my general question is really, to what extent can literary texts be used to write cultural history? And so that fundamental question has shaped a lot of my work and drawn me to these sorts of literary texts, the Feuilleton, that I think balance historical value with literary value. So the Feuilleton that I selected to just say a few brief words about is the Feuilleton No Apologies by Vladimir Jabotinsky, which was published in the immediate aftermath of the Bayless trial, when Mendel Bayless was accused of ritual murder, that is, using the blood of Christian children in Jewish rituals. And while I won't speak to sort of this text on the inside, I will speak to the way that I think it can be used in the classroom, and how these kinds of sources can be used to teach Zionism and to teach Jewish nationalism, especially unmoored from what is often a discussion that centers on Israel-Palestine, that is the geographic center of Israel-Palestine. This is a text that is really a product of Jabotinsky's European milieu. So some of the things that I want to point out about this source in teaching is to talk about the relationship of emotion to politics. Throughout this Feuilleton, you see a kind of simmering resentment and anger, all of which lead Jabotinsky to claim towards the end of the piece that Jews need their own black shirts too. That is, we need our own version of right-wing Jewish nationalist politics. And to use this source as a way of talking about the textual life of emotions and sentiment, pleasure and revulsion, all of which feed into and inflect political Zionism as a kind of expression of being Jewish in Eastern Europe. The other thing that this piece brings to the fore is that although a Feuilleton might be published in a particular language and a particular place, its lens might be on somewhere else. And so while Jabotinsky is talking about the Bayless trial, he's also talking at the same time about the kind of society that he envisions in Palestine. And the other aspect of this, which is not generally specifically related to Jabotinsky, is just the materiality of these feuilletons. It would be very interesting to see these texts in the flesh, as it were, and to understand how they feel in your hands. And I think there's something very immediately emotional and sensory about Jabotinsky's language that lends itself to thinking about that in terms of how this type of feuilleton would have been read. Would it have been read at a certain period in the week? Would it have been read in a cafe? All of these kinds of things just sort of spark my interest. The other thing is just that the feuilleton itself, and I think you see this in Jabotinsky's piece, is that it was seen as a space of kind of light reading or a trifle, a place where seriousness was not necessarily privileged. And yet at the same time, a piece like this shows that the form was quite fluid, and though it might have been below the line and perceived as an insignificant element of a Jewish newspaper, or any newspaper really, there was some truth through its trifle. There was some truth. I liken it almost to stand-up comedy, where everyone is laughing and everyone is making light of a situation, but in reality, very serious issues of political and ethical importance are being discussed. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eli. Yes, one of the things that I'll point out about the site briefly, although we'll get to more of the site just in a minute, is that we have at least the beginnings of a keyword search, and some of the themes that we see: anti-Semitism, gender, I don't know, others are escaping me, but we have many of them: tradition, modernity. All of these are terms that you can use to search when it comes to the website, and we'll continue to improve that feature as we go along. along. Let me go now to our last presenter for this section, and that's going to take us back to Shachar Pinsker. Shachar.
Okay, thank you so much, Naomi. That was fascinating to hear everybody, and I will be very brief and talk about really two very briefly about two texts in German that were written more or less in the same time in the Weimar period. But before I move to that, I just want to thank people that I forgot to thank before, and these are people who really helped us along the way as students, and later on when they moved on and are not student anymore. So thank you. I see some of you are here. Thank you to Yaakov Hershkovitz and to Nick Underwood and to Nadav Lineal, who helped a lot to put together the project, to put together the website, to communicate with many people, and to Marina Majorsky, who is a student, a PhD student, who helped also not just with wonderful translations from Ladino, but also with editing some of translations from other languages as well. So I just want to briefly comment on two texts, and I put both of them in the chat here. Of course, there are, I don't know how many, thousands and thousands of texts written by German Jews in the Feuilleton, and I note that some of the heavy weights and maybe most well known, beginning with Heinrich Heine, who was already mentioned before, and continuing with people like Theodor Herzl, we don't have them yet on the website. And what we do have right now are two texts that were written more or less in the same time in the Weimar period, and are very different from each other. But also, I wanna point to some shared element. One of them was written by Joseph Roth in the mainstream non-Jewish newspaper Frankfurter Zeitung in 1925, and the other one was written and published by Doris Wittner, who wrote in the Jüdische Liberale Zeitung, which is the official paper of the Association for Liberal Judaism in Germany. So obviously these are very different from each other in the place where they publish, the kind of the audience that they speak to, and also the gender element. But both of them are really, I think, and this is something that Matt Endelman and Kerry Wallach, who suggested these texts, translated them or helped translate them, and wrote wonderful commentaries about them, really brought into the picture. And I think a lot of it is really thinking about what does it mean to write in a Feuilleton in German to Jewish and non-Jewish audience, and how through that we can get to some major issues about what does it mean to be German Jews? What does it mean to be European Jews? Issues of acculturation, assimilation, anti-Semitism, nationalism, Zionism, all of that through a text that is relatively short, that is below the line, and also texts that are not, that are reviews of other texts. So both of them are actually the occasion for these two feuilletons are book reviews, which I think we see a lot in feuilletons, that they really engage with other works. Of course, with Joseph Roth, it really is a feuilleton about feuilleton. He writes about other feuilletonists like Alfred Polgar and Egon Kish, who wrote in Vienna, like Joseph Roth itself. And really the question is, what happens when German journalists write books? And this kind of tension that you find in the Feuilleton between being daily authors, between journalists, and here he points to the French word, the jour, and also the German, where it's timely. And the timeliness might be limited to only 24 hours, but the claim is basically that it's not timely, and not in the daily, the 24 hours, but timeliness is a virtue that is really about the time that we live in, about modernity, and about, in the Weimar period, what does it mean to live in the city with things moving so quickly, and how to capture it. And the claim is basically that the Feuilletons and the journalists who write in Feuilleton, whether they later on publish or collect it and publish in a book, this is really kind of the timeliness that is being captured. And the idea is that you don't have to be a dichter, you don't have to be, and there's a tension here with the whole idea of what does it mean to write poetry that is for posterity, for the ages, and what does it mean to write for a newspaper for the day, but how this is really about capturing something very important, very central in the 20th century. Now, it's interesting that Joseph Roth doesn't mention, only in the title of the book, the fact that these other feuilletonists, Egon Kisch and Polgar, are Jewish, and the Jewishness of the Feuilleton. But I think because it's published in the Frankfurter Zeitung, which was owned by Jews, and he himself was Jewish, it was very clear that this is part of the discourse. And that's something that Dittmer, writing in a Jewish liberal newspaper, that's the center, right? So it's another book review of Georg Brandes, a Danish Jewish philosopher and writer, and through the review of Brandeis, she really gets to not just what Brandeis wrote at the end of the 19th century, and of course being Danish and Jew, but really writing in this kind of discourse of Enlightenment and Romanticism and 19th century literature and culture, really get to this question of European or Jew, which she says, I think with kind of cheekiness and lightness that the Feuilleton maybe enables to say, this is, of course, the question that is on everybody's mind. Well, maybe it's not on everyone's mind, but it is definitely on the mind of her mind, and on the mind of her writer, in a time where there is acute awareness to anti-Semitism, to Zionism, to nationalism, and to the complexity of being German Jews. So again, the Feuilleton, I find it really fascinating, although I work mostly with Yiddish and Hebrew text, where these issues are in the foreground, how in German texts, whether they are written for Jewish audience or for general German audience, are able to deal with all these issues below the line in texts that are relatively short, that are full of wit, and yet able to deal with some of the weighty questions of the day. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Shachar, and thank you to all of our speakers so far. Let me open things up now and invite all of you, any of you who wish, to comment on the website as a whole or on specific aspects of the website, or to ask any questions you have about our project in general. I'll try. So please feel free to raise your hand on the hand feature, or speak up, or to use the chat. We'd love to hear from you. Nadav, please start us off.
So thank you. You can hear me? Okay. So thank you so much. This was fascinating and kind of a really great kind of tasting menu of what the website has to offer. And it's really fun, not just to see everyone here on Zoom, but also kind of see its newest iteration as someone who is kind of on the backstage and then behind the scenes of this at some point. So following, you know, the question of materiality, which I think is really central, and I want to hear maybe both right from the kind of co-directors of this project, but also from the commenters. How do you think about kind of the topography of the Feuilleton and the materiality, the physicality of the Feuilleton, both on the text you kind of offered a gloss of or a commentary of, but more generally, right? How do we think of materiality vis-a-vis, right, its kind of digital life right now on the website?
A wonderful question. Thank you. Let me take the opportunity here to begin an answer, and then I will open it up to other people. And here, of course, it can be the co-directors, but I think we all welcome anyone's comments here. And let me preface this by saying not everyone knows perhaps that Nadav was involved all through last year, which was a time of really intensive development of this website, especially because of COVID. We switched from in-person gatherings to developing the website. So thank you, Nadav, very much for being part of the development process. I think one place to start when thinking about the materiality, which is such an important thing when we think about this as a form of historical media, is how we interact with it now. You know, what it means to put up as a digital humanities project on a website where we almost strip it of what it once used to be. But the reality here, or one aspect of the reality of the feuilletons, I think, is that so many of them are buried. Yes, we have these really important digitization projects that makes these texts available and in some cases searchable, which is huge, right? JPress, compact memory, other initiatives have really transformed, I think, how anyone who works with periodicals as part of their scholarship can locate material, can search for material. But as you'll see from the website, we have many pieces here that aren't necessarily, you know, in those collections, that haven't been digitized before. I happen to see Tamir before me on my screen. To the best of my knowledge, his Ladino contributions these are microfilm scans, I think. The Moroccan materials that David Gedge brought us, those two are from microfilms. And so one thing that was really important to us in putting the project together was, when at all possible, to provide scans of the newspaper. Now, it's not the same thing of having that newspaper in your hands, but it was important not to say have reprints. You'll see it wasn't possible in all cases, and in some cases we're still looking for the originals. COVID and access to archives certainly didn't help those matters. But to the extent that we can, keeping reminders, even if they're visual markers in those scans, of where they came from, at least as a gesture in that direction. Anybody else want to reflect on this wonderful question about the materiality of these texts, and especially the second piece, which I didn't really touch on, which is how it might compare to the kind of in the digital age?
I'd love to take that up, Naomi, and thanks, Nadav, for a wonderful question. And one of the things I think is the most interesting, and it goes back to something that Scott started us off with, is the way that the feuilleton, you know, interacts in some way with our digital age. And as someone who's worked with Julia and with you and with everyone else on the website, you know, we have this tendency to think of the webs of the internet and of computers and of the digital as totally immaterial, is without bodies, without whatever. But obviously it's stored somewhere, maybe in Ann Arbor, maybe somewhere in Greenland. And what's interesting is, you know, you see a kind of a consistent marginalization of the materiality here, where the materiality is pushed literally to the bottom third of the page with below the line. And then with the materiality of the digital, well, it's embodied in all of our computers, you know, the bits and the bytes and all that sort of stuff are stored in places where, you know, we have absolutely no idea where they are. It could be in Ann Arbor, of course, I don't know. So I think the materiality is a point that should be talked about more in terms of the digital, and you should, and push against that sense that, just because it's online, not that you're suggesting this, not just because it's online doesn't mean that it's lost any of that materiality. I think that we just need new concepts to be able to talk about what that type of materiality means.
Thank you, Matt. And here too, hopefully you see in the chat Tamir's comment here about actually interesting that that figured into your choice of text. I think for many people who contributed or contribute to the project, sometimes, there's a feuilleton that jumps out at you that you have in mind, that's the one that people wanted to present in a conference or a workshop, or it was an obvious one to put on the website. But I think in many cases, for many of us, it was really a question of what text might speak to, well, the feuilleton as a form, in a particular language, in a particular place, in a particular time, but also what might speak to the space that we're creating here, which is to say something that was buried in the archive. And that seems to have motivated Tamir here in terms of the Ladino texts, which are such valuable contributions to our site. Chacha, go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, this discussion is really fascinating, but I want us also to remind us, just in response to Nadav's question, how important it was for the people who read it in the form as a newspaper. We have I saw so many stories and so many anecdotes that people would pick up the newspaper, take it, and the text of the Feuilleton would be the one that they would read first, before reading the other things above the line, the news of the day. And that's something, an element that is very important, that is, I think, a little difficult, as much as we try to do, to kind of replicate in the way that when you receive it once every day or once a week or once a month, and you follow, there is this kind of intimate relationship that is created between the readers and between the writer. And that's something that I think in the materiality of, like, to get the fresh newspaper that just came out and to read the latest installment, that's something that we have to remember. And, trying to kind of replicate it by having the actual text digitized, hopefully that's something that we find. And of course, we also know, I'm familiar with this from Eastern Europe, that it wasn't read just by one person, but sometimes moved from one to the other, and how these texts become this kind of source of knowledge, source of discussion of people. Have you heard what people what such and such was writing about in the last? So we have to remember this kind of material element and the kind of role that it fulfilled at the time.
Yeah, very much so. My own work, as it relates to feuilletons, focuses primarily on roman feuilletons, or basically fiction that is serialized in this space, which it's almost like a subcategory, which is to say it shares many features with the feuilleton in general, but it develops in some really interesting ways. You'll see several of these texts, these roman feuilletons, featured on the site. Michal spoke a bit earlier about some of those as well, but just like Shacha was saying, it's really transformative, not only the reading practices and journalist practices, right? The serialized novels we see from the middle of the 19th century in France really sell newspapers and really transform the industry. But within Jewish culture specifically, all of these things have really, lasting impacts, even as feuilletons perhaps lose their central place later on into the 20th century. Other questions or comments that people would like to bring up?
Anyone who contributed in any way or form, whether you have a question or you just comment, we're happy to hear. We have just a few minutes.
Yes, I would just like to ask if it's still possible to contribute feuilletons, if it's an ongoing project, to the website. Is it, if it's still possible to contribute to the website? Yes?
Sure, I'll start off with that one, and then Matt, I'll turn it over to you. Yes, So a resounding yes on that one, but let me sort of explain, give you a sense of where we stand. You know, we were very fortunate to have support from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the NEH, that led to the design and implementation of this website that basically allowed us to create this framework. And so that is what we are kind of celebrating today, and the website that we are able to share with all of you. But we have built something that we very much hope to continue to expand. So, you know, we will continue, the project I think will continue to unfold in various different ways. We're still planning, we're hoping to put together an edited collection of essays that are based on some of the scholarship that has developed around there. But for the website, we certainly welcome contributions, and we also welcome suggestions of text to be included. Matt, you want to add on there?
Sure. I'm sharing a link to a Google form right now. And so fortunately, and again, thanks to Julia, a lot of the hard work of coding and getting the structures in place has been done. But you know, we'd love to hear of ideas that you have in terms of feuilletons that might be good for the website. You know, in a sense, they have to be feuilletons. There are all sorts of text sorts that are sort of adjacent. And even though, as Naomi was talking, you know, there's different levels of engagement and bandwidth, I guess was the best way to put it, that we have for adding new texts. One of the cool and easy things that I think that we can do is, you know, even if we can't immediately get to adding and finding a translator and getting the scans of text, we can certainly start building a larger bibliography of texts that at least has, you know, current suggestions, sort of a on deck idea. Which would be relatively easy to set up, and would then be able to get some of the feuilletons at least on people's radar. So please use the form here. Oh, the form is closed. I guess I didn't open it. This was made very recently. Thank you for that. So I will open it in 1 second, and we'll tell everybody to click on it then. Sorry about that.
Okay. Thank you, Matt. And thank you for your question, Michal. Anyone else? Any questions you'd like to ask? Or any contributors want to reflect? Okay. Well, since I have an eye on the clock here, we will be finishing up within the next couple minutes. We do invite you to submit ideas for the website for the future as we continue to develop it, and also to be engaged in our project in various ways. If you are not already on your email list, please do feel free to contact us. You know, I think we have a link for that as well, but you can find our contact information on the website. But let me hand things over to Matt to kind of reflect on the website and the project a little bit as we wrap up our session today.
Okay, sorry, I'm not finding this. Google Forms is very opaque at points. So I wanted to just share I'm going to share my screen here. I have a little presentation with some screenshots of, you know, what it took to make the website. I assume some of you are familiar with digital humanities work, building websites, building other tools. But, you know, it took, there's no timestamp on this, but it took quite a while to move from this this spreadsheet that had a lot of the, that had the information for the website, to move from this spreadsheet to a working, functioning database and website. And in fact, it took a lot of time to make, you know, to turn all of these values from red to orange to green. And thank you to everyone who, as contributors and project staff who helped work on this. But the website is hosted on the free and open access content management system for digital humanities publications called Omeka, and the new version of that, Omeka S. It was really fun to be able to work with this more in terms of the, I've worked with this in teaching settings, but to use the updated version, which is much more robust. And one of the goals that we had was to make it look more than just something that looks like the standard themes that you get with WordPress or something like that. And that's really to Julia's credit for the wonderful web design here, as well as our graphic designer Beth, who provided the website design. And just a little bit of the behind the scenes of what you see or what one works on when one's working on a project like this. There's a lot of different sort of, it's a lot of working with databases and working with what are called items in Omeka, in the digital humanities speak. And so everything that you're accessing here is an item, and the items then have various properties, including all of the metadata that then becomes the display that you see on your screen, as well as you see here media attached to it, which are the images that then display on your screen, and things like mapping, which allows us to create rich digital maps and materials like that. We've been, I'm giving the brief version and the basic version of this. There's also Julia presented with Joe Bauer, who's at the LSA at the University of Michigan in the IT department, and here's a link to their poster that they presented to talk about. I have a screenshot of there, but you can see the full poster and I believe even video of the presentation if you want to learn more about the interactions that we've had with libraries and with the IT services at U of M, which all of whom have been exceedingly helpful. One of the cool things is that given we were able to pull some analytic data, user analytics, on who's already been using the site. I assume a lot of the people here are some of the people that will be reflected here. We had a big uptick when we started advertising, of course. But we've had users from mainly the United States, Israel, Canada, Germany, France, and the United Kingdom. But we've even had a few users from Spain, Finland, New Zealand, Turkey, Jordan, and Iraq, all of which are very interesting. Of course, it's our goal to grow these numbers, but given that we're trained all as historians and literary scholars, social media promotion is sort of a hobby horse. So maybe we'll hire a social media consultant next and vamp up on that. What's really interesting is the user activity to see how people enter and exit the website. And it seems most people end up on the homepage, then going to the Explore page, sort of the splash page where you can click on various feuilletons. And then finally to individual pages. Most frequently visited pages are, of course, the About, Introduction, Explore, and Index. But shout out to the Yiddishists that the Yiddish splash page is the most frequently visited page here that gives us the overview of all the Yiddish texts that are on here. I believe this is one of these is the Letters of a Parisian Woman. I forget what the second one is. And finally, this is what the suggestion form would look like. So please keep that open. We'd love to hear from you. Please save the link. Oh, it works now. Wonderful. Or it might only work because it's shared with you, Shahar. Oh, that's how I do it. So I'll have this open in a second. And I just wanted to conclude, we're at time, but I wanted to conclude by saying one of the things that's been really exciting about the Feuilleton and working on the Feuilleton in a digital humanities setting is exactly sort of the strange space and time that it brings us into, both in terms of its relationship to modernity as well as our digital present. And that is, as an area, as Carrie highlighted, of politics and of news, especially with new media, I think it's Feuilleton remains exceedingly relevant, obviously, for the study of modern Jewish cultures. But I think as this triangle of politics, news, and new media continues to be exceedingly important, I think the Feuilleton, and especially the Jewish Feuilleton, maintains its relevance today. So at this point, if anybody wants to stick around, I'd be happy to answer questions about the website, Julia too, or if there's any ideas that people have. I realize it's the end of the end of the time that we allotted, but just wanted to open it up once again to see if anybody had further ideas, a wish list, something that'd be like, oh, it would be really awesome if the website had this.
And since I guess this marks kind of the end of the official thing, let me just thank you everyone for joining us. And thanks to so many of you for participating in so many different ways. We look forward to more collaborations.
Yeah, thank you to everybody. And as Matt said, if any of you have time and want to stick around and just chat with us informally about your ideas for further moving the project, we're happy to stay for a few minutes. But otherwise, thank you to everybody who participated and everybody who spoke and everybody who contributed in so many ways. It's wonderful to mark it with all of you remotely, and there'll be more.
Thank you, Naomi, Matt, and Shachar.
Thank you, Scott.